The Forbidden Love That Destroyed a Southern Dynasty. The year was 1868. The American Civil War had ended, but the wounds were still fresh across the Mississippi Delta. Cotton fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and in the heart of it all stood one of the most powerful families in the South. But that same year, a scandal would erupt that would shake their empire to its core and expose the dark secrets of a society built on lies and control. This is the true story of Isabel Calhoun, the daughter of the mighty Colonel Silas Calhoun, and how her forbidden romance with Jonathan Reed, a black man who had been born into slavery, created a child that would bring down an entire dynasty and reveal the twisted contradictions of the elite South. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there, and make sure to subscribe to stay updated with more amazing historical stories. Chapter 1: The World of Secrets. The Mississippi Delta in 1868 felt heavy with unspoken truths. Even when evening came, the air seemed to press down like a weight on everyone's shoulders. Cotton fields spread for miles, looking beautiful from a distance, but hiding the brutal reality underneath. At the center of it all sat the Calhoun plantation, a massive two-story house with tall white columns that seemed to hold up more than just the roof. They held generations of dark secrets. Colonel Silas Calhoun still carried himself like the Confederate officer he once was, even though his gray uniform had long since been put away. He didn't talk about losing the war anymore. Not because he was over it, but because he refused to accept that the world had moved on without him. And inside those grand walls lived Isabel Calhoun, his only daughter, his pride and joy, and perhaps his greatest challenge. Isabel was everything a Southern belle was supposed to be on the surface: pale skin, beautiful features, and hair that caught the light like autumn leaves. She had been taught to smile at the right moments, play piano for guests, and marry into another powerful family. But there was something they hadn't prepared her for, a restless spirit that couldn't be tamed. Most days, Isabel wandered around the edges of their property like she was searching for something. She watched the workers from a distance, men and women who were technically free now after the war, but freedom was just a word in these parts. They still picked cotton, still worked under white supervision, still kept their eyes down when spoken to, all except one man. Jonathan Reed was different. He didn't bow his head or shuffle his feet when white people passed by. He didn't whisper apologies or try to make himself invisible. He walked through those fields like he belonged to himself. And that was revolutionary in 1868 Mississippi. Though he had once been enslaved, Jonathan had earned something rare: respect. He spoke like someone who had educated himself, worked like someone with nothing left to fear, and when he looked at Isabel, his eyes didn't look away. That was the first dangerous moment. Not the looking itself, but the fact that she looked back. Chapter 2: The Silent Beginning. It started without words. Isabel would ride her horse past the area where Jonathan worked, and sometimes she would slow down just enough to notice him. Sometimes he would pause in his tasks just long enough to acknowledge her presence. No conversation, just these tiny moments of recognition. Until one evening, as the sun was setting and painting everything orange and red, she got off her horse early and walked the rest of the way home. She knew he was watching. And that night, sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, she asked the cook if there were any old poetry books stored away in the attic. When she found one, yellowed with age and smelling of dust and memories, she tucked it into her dress. 2 days later, she left it where she knew Jonathan would find it, on a stone wall near the old well under the big sycamore tree. At first, he didn't touch it, but 3 days after that, the book reappeared in the same spot. But now it was open to a specific page with a line marked in careful handwriting. Love does not ask permission from history. Isabel read those words over and over until they seemed to burn into her mind. And the next time they passed each other near the stables, she gave him a small nod. It was the kind of acknowledgement that could get people killed in the Old South. That evening, Colonel Calhoun sat in his parlor, drinking bourbon and polishing his silence like a weapon. He looked at Isabel over the rim of his glass and said, "You've been quieter lately." She folded her hands carefully and replied, "There's not much to say." "Then find something proper to think about," he said with authority. "I hear the Whitmore family has a son back from Charleston." She smiled in a way that revealed nothing. "I'm sure they do." Outside, beyond the glow of the house lights, Jonathan Reed stood by the stables, his hands still marked by the day's work. He looked toward the window and saw her shadow moving inside. He knew what people said about black men who looked at white women for too long. He knew the consequences, but he also knew something else. He had survived a war that wasn't meant for him to survive. He had survived slavery, violence, hunger, and watching others break under the pressure. He could survive the risk of a glance, and maybe, just maybe, something more than that. But before this attraction could become a scandal, it had to become a secret worth risking everything. G4. Chapter 3. When darkness became their friend. Summer nights in the Delta seemed to last forever. The kind of darkness that didn't just fall from the sky but settled into everything like a heavy blanket. In the Calhoun house, light meant order and control. Gas lamps flickered in the hallways, servants moved through their nightly routines, and Isabel played piano because it was expected of her, not because she wanted to. But when those lamps went dim and the house fell into the kind of silence that secrets thrive in, she became someone different. She started walking the halls without shoes, not to rebel, but following some instinct that told her quiet footsteps could carry her away from the noise in her heart. The secret exchanges continued, but now they were getting bolder. Another book appeared by the well, wrapped in cloth to protect it from suspicion. Inside, there was a note written in charcoal instead of ink. How do you cage something that was born to run? No signature was needed. She knew who had written it. Her reply came in the margins of the same book. You don't. You run with it, or you let it break your hands trying. These written conversations led to something more dangerous. Actual meetings. They claimed it was accidental if anyone had asked. The old barn behind the west field had been forgotten and was half-rotted, with gaps in the wood wide enough for moonlight to stream through. She went there with her sketchbook. He came there to think. When their eyes met inside that barn, neither one turned away. I didn't know you came here, she said softly. I'll leave, he offered. No. Just that single word, but it changed everything. They sat back to back, careful not to touch. She read aloud from the poetry book, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger. He listened with his eyes closed. You sound like those words as were written for your voice, he said. You talk like someone who shouldn't be here, she replied. I'm not, he admitted. Not in their world, but I am in this one. After a moment of silence, she asked the question no proper Southern lady was supposed to ask. Were you ever taught to read? He laughed, but there was pain in it. Taught? No. But I learned anyway. My mother showed me how before they sold her away from me. She carved letters into tree bark, into the dirt, into my memory. The barn went completely quiet. She didn't speak right away. She just reached out to place the poetry book between them, where they both could see it. Then read with me, she whispered. From that night forward, the barn became their sanctuary. They met in shadows, always close, but never too close. She brought food, books, and newspapers. He brought stories, passion, and pieces of dreams he had kept hidden for too long. He told her about the whipping tree and how the bark still smelled like blood. She told her about her mother's death and how her father had buried his grief in alcohol. They both learned what the other had never been allowed to say out loud, that pain lives loudest in silence. One night, a terrible storm rolled in from the east. Wind tore across the fields like a warning, and thunder cracked so loud it shook the old barn's frame. She almost didn't come that night, but she did. Soaked to the skin, shivering, but more alive than she ever felt in her father's house. Jonathan lit a small lantern. Its glow caught the water dripping from her hair and the rise and fall of her breathing. You shouldn't have come out in this, he said quietly. I couldn't stay away, she answered. They didn't speak after that. Not with words. She moved toward him with trembling hands, not from fear, but from finally understanding something. Not the kind of understanding they taught in church, but the kind that comes when two people realize they've already crossed a line, and the only mistake left would be pretending they haven't. Their lips met Lee's. A confession. Not driven by lust or scandal, but by defiance against a world that said their love was impossible. By the time she returned to the house, the storm had passed. But inside her, a new storm was just beginning. Because now it wasn't just poetry or shared pain. It was real. And the South never forgave love like that. But before her body would begin to show the evidence of their love, there were still precious nights left to treasure. Chapter 4. The touch that changed everything. There are touches that heal, touches that hurt, and touches that change the course of history. What happened next was the third kind. After the storm, their meetings became more frequent and more reckless, as if the barn walls had absorbed their fear and replaced it with desperate need. Isabel no longer snuck out carefully. She walked boldly under the moonlight in her white nightgown, as if daring the stars themselves to report her. Jonathan stopped leaving their conversations half-finished. He started asking questions the South had no good answers for. "What do you think happens after we die?" he would ask. "Do you think your father ever loved anything he couldn't own? Would you still talk to me if I were in chains again?" She never avoided his questions. She only asked her own in return. "Would you still love me if I went back to my old life?" His silence told her everything she needed to know. The kiss was no longer just a memory. It had become a ritual. Every meeting ended with it. Every goodbye held on to it. It was how they remembered who they truly were, not who the world demanded they pretend to be. But it hadn't gone further than that, not until one particular night. Fireflies swarmed around the barn entrance like tiny lanterns celebrating something sacred. The heat hung thick in the air, mixed with the scent of earth and sweat, and something ancient. She arrived barefoot again, but this time not as a curious girl chasing mystery, as a woman carrying purpose. Jonathan was already inside, reading by lamplight, one of the poems she had left for him. When he looked up, something shifted in the air between them, not in her dress, not in his hands, but in the very atmosphere of that small space. The silence stretched until she whispered, "I'm not afraid." He remained perfectly still. "You should be." She stepped closer. "I am." She placed her hand over his heart. "But not of you." What happened next wasn't sudden or desperate. It was centuries of injustice finally breaking apart, chains cracking in the space between heartbeats. His hand trembled as it traced the line of her face. Her lips parted not in shock, but in surrender to something bigger than both of them. When their bodies came together, it wasn't about lust or forbidden desire. It was about recognition. Recognition of stolen generations, of silenced songs, of all the black men who had been taken by force. And now, for once, one who was choosing. Recognition of all the white women who had been told their purity was sacred. And now, for once, one who was reclaiming it for herself. There was no shame in that room, only breathing and the sound of justice wrapped in human form. Afterward, they lay in silence, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing invisible words on her back like unwritten poetry. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked. "I believe in consequences," he replied. She smiled against his skin. "I think we just created both." But the night was not empty of watchers. Outside in the tree line beyond the barn, a shadow moved. A figure turned away, silent as sin, quick as revenge. Someone had seen them, and the Delta keeps its secrets only until it decides to reveal them. Before her belly would begin to swell, before the whispers would turn to threats, there would be judgment, and it was already walking toward the main house. Chapter 5. The Life Growing Inside. It started with a cue, uneasy feeling in her stomach. Not fear, not guilt, not regret, just a sudden change in her body as she watched the sun rise over the fields and felt something shift inside her that belonged to both of them. She thought it might be nerves or the heat or just the intensity of everything that had happened. But by the time she missed her second monthly cycle, she knew for certain. The mirror in Isabel's bedroom never lied. Her face still looked the same. Her body was still clothed in expensive silk, but her eyes had changed completely. They were no longer searching for something. They were making decisions. In the quiet of her room, she placed her hand over her lower belly and whispered out loud, "He's still with me." She didn't cry. Not yet. Tears were for people who had regrets, and she had none. Not about the nights, not about the passion, not about the kiss that had planted a revolution in her womb. Jonathan was working in the fields when she came walking across the cotton rows. No disguise, no secret signals, just her. He saw her approaching and the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Time didn't stop, but it definitely paused to listen. She reached him, looked directly into his eyes, and in a voice that carried both terror and strength, she said, "I'm carrying your child." His breath disappeared completely. He reached for her hand, the same hand that had once been trained to hold teacups and fans for fancy parties. Now it was holding the future. "Are you certain?" he asked. She nodded firmly. "I know my own body, and I know what we created together." He looked toward the horizon where the white cotton fields met the blood-red sky. Then he said something that would echo through both their lives. "We can't stay here." They met again that night in the barn that now felt too small to contain the storm they were carrying. He spoke first. "There's a group in Memphis. Freed people who help others disappear. People like us. I have connections who could—" She interrupted him. "My father will never let me leave. He'll hunt you down." "He already would if he knew half of what we've done," Jonathan said. "And if I run away, I lose everything I've worked for." He stepped closer to her. "And if you stay, you lose us." The weight of the Delta pressed down on them, the ghosts of enslaved women who had been assaulted in silence, the bones buried in fields that were never given names. And now, in the belly of a white woman, grew something the South never expected, justice wrapped in flesh. Days passed while she tried to hide her condition, corsets pulled tighter than ever, dresses chosen for their loose fit. But the plantation was full of people who knew how to read signs, servants who whispered among themselves, older women who had seen it all before. One evening at the dinner table, Colonel Calhoun paused in the middle of eating. He looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. "You're looking pale lately," he said with suspicion in his voice. "Unwell," she forced a smile. "Maybe it's just the change in weather." He didn't blink. "Or maybe something else is growing inside you." The knife in her hand shook. Her mother's fine china rattled against the tablecloth. She didn't answer his accusation, and he didn't ask again directly. But that night, she heard him talking in low voices with Reverend Morgan on the porch. "Watch her closely. Something's not right." She got word to Jonathan immediately. "We don't have much time left." But he already knew. The stables had gone too quiet. The workers seemed too nervous. Something dangerous was building. The kind of storm the South created not with clouds, but with ropes and fire and harsh lessons. When she returned to her room that night, there was a white dress laid out on her bed, lace, high-necked, completely pure-looking. Beside it was a note in her father's handwriting. "The Whitmore boy is coming to visit. You will do what's expected of you." She stared at that dress for a very long time. Then, without saying a word, she opened her window and threw it down into the garden below. Because this child, their child, was not a mistake to be covered up. He was a seed of change, and she refused to let him grow up in a house built on lies and silence. But before the world could see the evidence of her pregnancy, they would try to destroy the man who had helped create it. Chapter 6. When the Truth Exploded. Colonel Silas Calhoun didn't really sleep anymore. Not peacefully. He would doze in his chair with bourbon in his hand and firelight reflecting in his eyes, with the sound of old battles still echoing in his memory. But true rest was for men who hadn't lost wars or daughters. And in the oppressive quiet of the Calhoun plantation, he had begun to notice far too much. The way Isabel moved more slowly now. The way her expensive dresses no longer fit her waist properly. The way the servants fell completely silent whenever she entered a room. He could smell secrets the way some men smell rain coming. And this particular secret reeked of betrayal. The information came from a kitchen servant, as it always did. A nervous slip of the tongue, a fearful glance, and then the name. Jonathan. The colonel didn't shout or strike anyone. He simply walked out to his porch, sat down in his favorite chair, and whispered to the darkness, "I should have eliminated him years ago." By morning, the entire plantation felt different. The workers moved in uncomfortable silence, the horses seemed restless, and the air itself tasted like metal, like blood about to be spilled. Jonathan was in the stables fixing leather harnesses when two overseers approached him. They didn't come with ropes or guns, but with something far more dangerous in the South. Smug confidence. "Kolos, Nell wants to have a conversation with you," one of them announced. Jonathan carefully wiped his hands, clean, and stood up straight. He had known this day would eventually come, but he hadn't expected it to arrive so quietly. They led him not to the fields or the barn, but to the front steps of the main house, where Colonel Calhoun stood like a monument built from pure hatred. Isabel was there too, held firmly by her aunt's grip, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with defiant fire. The colonel stared at Jonathan with eyes sharp enough to cut through bone. "You've taken something that doesn't belong to you," he said with deadly calm. "You've disgraced this house and contaminated my bloodline." Jonathan didn't speak immediately, didn't lower his gaze. "Answer me directly," the colonel demanded. "Did you lie with my daughter?" Jonathan stepped forward, not as someone's property, not as a former slave, but as a man with nothing left to lose. "Not as someone beneath her," he said clearly. "As her equal." The sound that followed was like thunder. Gasps, shouts, the kind of noise that happens when dangerous truth gets spoken too loudly. The colonel's fist moved faster than anyone expected. Jonathan fell backward, blood streaming from his lip. But then he did something that shocked everyone. He laughed, quiet and bitter, but unmistakably defiant. "You still believe your name gives you power over people," he said, wiping blood from his mouth. "You still think she's your property to control?" The colonel's face went dark with rage. He turned to his overseers and gave the order they'd all been expecting. "Strip him and tie him to the tree." They dragged Jonathan to the whipping tree, the same ancient oak where his mother had bled decades earlier. The same tree they had tried to cover with ivy and forget about, but trees remember everything. The bark still carried the stains of old violence. They tied his hands and ripped the shirt from his back. Isabel screamed with a voice that could shatter glass. The colonel picked up the whip, without looking at her. 1 strike, 2, 3. Each crack echoed across the cotton fields like a gunshot, not just causing physical pain, but reopening historical wounds that had never properly healed. But Jonathan refused to scream. Instead, he looked directly at Isabel, even through the blood and agony, and he smiled. Not with happiness, but with unbreakable love, with the kind of defiance that says pain cannot have the final word. When the beating finally ended, the colonel dropped the whip beside Jonathan's bleeding body. He stays locked in the equipment shed. No food, no water. Let him learn some humility from hunger. Then he turned to his daughter with eyes like ice. "Whatever's growing in your belly gets removed tomorrow." That night, Isabel sat by her bedroom window, gripping the blood-stained poetry book in her fists. She didn't weep. Instead, she sharpened her resolve like a blade. Every heartbeat became a hammer. Every tear she refused to shed became ammunition for the war she was about to wage, because this was no longer about forbidden love. This was about survival, justice, and making sure that the fire in her blood finally got a name. Chapter 7. The Rescue in Darkness. The equipment shed behind the Calhoun stables wasn't designed to hold human beings. It was built for storing tools, broken saddles, rusted chains, and memories that everyone wanted to forget. But now, it imprisoned Jonathan Reed, bleeding, shirtless, tied at the wrists, and burning with something stronger than physical pain. The unbreakable power of memory. He remembered his mother's voice whispering through prison bars. "They can chain your hands, baby, but never your mind, never your soul." He remembered every crack of the whip, how it had kissed his back like a twisted lover, how the colonel's arm had swung not with any sense of justice, but with pure rage that his precious legacy had been touched by someone he still thought of as property. He remembered Isabel's scream, sharp and raw like the cry of a wounded animal, the kind of sound that makes birds abandon their nests and fly away. But most of all, he remembered how he had refused to scream back, not once, not to give them the satisfaction, not to let them believe that pain could break what love had built. Outside, the sun had disappeared behind the cotton fields, leaving nothing but suffocating shadows. Inside the shed, the air was thick with heat that tasted of sweat, rust, and decay. Jonathan's wrists were bound above his head, his feet barely able to touch the dirt floor. Flies swarmed around his open wounds, but he didn't even flinch when they bit him, because pain had become a language he spoke fluently, and he still had important things to say. In the main house, Isabel sat in her darkened bedroom, rocking back and forth like someone losing their mind. Her hair had come completely undone, her dress hung loose around her swollen belly, and the pregnancy, now impossible to hide from anyone with eyes, pulsed beneath her ribs like a second heartbeat keeping time with her own. Aunt Margaret brought her a tray of food that she completely ignored. "Isabel, please," the older woman begged. "If you just admit it was a mistake, that he forced himself on you, the colonel might show some mercy." Isabel's laugh was dry and bitter as old wood. "Mercy died the same day Mama did." Aunt Margaret stepped backward and made the sign of the cross. "You're going to destroy this entire family." "No," Isabel said, standing up slowly with newfound strength. "I'm going to be its mirror. Show it what it really looks like." She waited until the clock struck midnight, then slipped out of the house barefoot. Her white nightgown seemed to glow under the moonlight like a ghost walking among the living. She carried nothing except a stolen key from the groundskeeper's belt and a cloth soaked in rose water for cleaning wounds. The plantation was eerily quiet. Even the dogs didn't bark, as if they instinctively knew to stay silent during this sacred rescue mission. She reached the shed and unlocked the door with trembling hands. It opened with a creak that sounded like a confession being spoken aloud. Inside, the small lantern she carried cast golden light over his broken body, and she nearly collapsed from the horror of what she saw. His back was a canvas of open cuts. His arms shook from supporting his weight for so many hours. His lips were cracked and dry from thirst, but his eyes still burned with undefeated fire. "Isabel," he whispered through damaged vocal cords. She ran to him immediately. I'm here. She carefully wrapped the cloth around his wrists and untied the ropes with gentle precision, tears falling silently but unstoppably down her cheeks. When he finally collapsed into her arms, she held him like she had never held anything before, like he was her child, like he was her destiny, like he was the most precious thing in a world determined to destroy everything beautiful. They didn't speak for a very long time. She cleaned his wounds as carefully as possible, humming broken lullabies her mother had once sung during happier days. Jonathan didn't cry, but he allowed his head to rest in her lap, and for him, that was surrender enough. After what felt like hours of healing silence, he whispered, "He's not going to stop hunting us." She nodded with grim understanding. "I know." He looked up at her face, swollen from the beating, but with a voice crystal clear. "Then we don't stop fighting either." The next morning, the colonel found the shed completely empty. Chains swinging uselessly, blood pooled on the dirt floor, and the door left deliberately open. Not broken by force, but opened with a key. Left as a message. He roared like a wounded animal, smashing a whiskey glass against the wall in pure fury. His daughter was gone. The man was gone, and his sacred legacy was now dirt beneath their escaping feet. But Isabel hadn't actually run away. Not yet. She had taken Jonathan to the far edge of their property, to an old abandoned smokehouse that no one had used since the war ended, hidden beneath moss and the weight of forgotten time. There she nursed him back to health for several days, bringing food, clean water, and healing medicine. Her own body ached, her belly continued to swell with their child, but her determination only grew stronger. She was no longer Colonel Silas Calhoun's obedient daughter. She had become Jonathan Reed's partner in revolution. One evening, as crickets screamed their songs outside the hidden refuge, Jonathan managed to sit up slowly, his wounds scabbed over but far from completely healed. He looked at her with deep intensity and said something unexpected. "I want to see him one more time." She blinked in confusion. "Who?" "Your father, face to face. One final time." Isabel stiffened with fear. "He'll kill you on sight." Jonathan shook his head slowly. "No, he's already dead inside. He just doesn't realize it yet." He looked at her growing belly with tender love. "At least this way, our son will know his father never hid from the truth." Chapter 8. The Final Confrontation. They planned it with the careful precision of generals preparing for battle. At dawn, when the plantation workers moved slowly through their routines and the main house still rested in sleepy silence, Jonathan would walk openly down the field path. No disguise, no attempt to hide, just his wounded body, bleeding but unbroken, completely alive and unashamed. When he reached the front steps of the grand house, every servant and worker froze in place, mouths hanging open, eyes wide with disbelief. No one moved or spoke. They just watched this impossible moment unfold. He knocked on the front door, not once, but 3 deliberate times. Loud, steady, and final, like the sound of judgment arriving. Colonel Calhoun opened the door himself, and for the first time in his entire life, he was the one who stepped backward in shock. Jonathan's voice was completely calm and controlled. "This is not your world anymore." The colonel tried to form words, but his voice failed him completely. Behind him, Isabel appeared like an avenging angel. Dressed in bright red, her hair braided back with pride, her belly round and prominently displayed like a badge of honor, she stepped beside Jonathan, took his hand without shame, and said directly to her father, "This child carries no shame, only truth, and truth doesn't bow to anyone." Silas Calhoun's face cracked like old stone. He raised his hand to strike her down, but Jonathan stepped forward with a look in his eyes that was no longer fearful, but filled with righteous judgment. "Touch her," he said with deadly calm, "and I swear on every ancestor watching from beyond, your name will rot in shame before the grave can take you." The colonel's hand slowly lowered, not from mercy or compassion, but from complete and total defeat. They left the house together, walking hand in hand. No one tried to stop them. The servants didn't interfere. The field workers bowed their heads in respectful silence, and the morning wind carried something that hadn't passed through the Mississippi Delta in generations: pure human dignity. That night, the Calhoun plantation sat in oppressive silence, not from peace, but from the weight of shame that had finally been exposed to daylight. In the woods, under a sky too vast to contain or control, Isabel and Jonathan lay beside a small fire they had built together. He gently traced the outline of her swollen belly. She whispered possible names for their unborn child. And for the first time since this whole story began, they didn't feel like criminals running from justice. They felt like the founders of something completely new. But before this child could be safely born into freedom, the Old South would demand to strike one final, devastating blow. Chapter 9: The Birth of Revolution. They say blood runs thicker than water, but in the Mississippi Delta, it's fire that reveals the deepest truths. And on the night Isabel Calhoun finally burned away her old identity, the flames whispered secrets that even the cotton fields didn't dare repeat out loud. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The old smokehouse had protected them long enough for Jonathan's physical wounds to heal properly, and for Isabel's pregnancy to reach full term. But every day brought fresh dangers: the sound of boots crushing through underbrush, the glint of metal weapons near the tree line, the smell of men who had been paid to stop thinking and just follow orders. The colonel still refused to speak his daughter's name aloud, but he also refused to bury her memory. He was waiting patiently, not for forgiveness or reconciliation, but for the perfect moment to deliver punishment. Isabel understood they couldn't run away forever, but she also knew they would never beg for mercy. Not from Northern sympathizers, not from legal authorities, not even from the passage of time itself. What they needed wasn't escape from their situation. They needed complete liberation from it, and that meant cutting the final rope still connecting her to the past. The Calhoun family name. She returned to the main house one last time, not sneaking through shadows, but walking boldly with pure willpower. Wearing the same red dress her mother had worn to church the year before she died, Isabel entered the house without asking permission. No one dared to stop her. Not the butler, not the overseers, not the distant cousins who had moved into the guest rooms like vultures waiting to feast on inheritance. They all stepped aside because she no longer carried herself like someone's property. She moved like truth itself, walking among lies. Colonel Calhoun was on the back porch smoking a cigar and staring at nothing in particular. When she stepped into his view, he didn't stand up or acknowledge her presence. He just looked at her swollen belly and scowled with disgust. "So," he muttered bitterly, "you came here to make a public spectacle of yourself?" "No," Isabel replied with steel in her voice. "I came to bury you properly." His lip curled into an ugly sneer. "You think that illegitimate child gives you some kind of power over me?" "No," she said firmly. "I give myself power." She reached into her bag and pulled out the family Bible, the original one that contained generations of Calhoun names written inside, from slave traders to senators, all recorded in careful ink like a roster of sins. She turned to the back page where her own name was listed beneath her father's. Isabel Calhoun, born 1849. She took out a sharp penknife and began cutting her name out of the book. Slow, deliberate, and completely final. The blade hissed through the old paper like a snake shedding its skin. Then she held the torn piece of paper between her fingers, walked over to the small fire burning in the metal brazier beside his chair, and dropped her name into the flames. The fire consumed it instantly. Ash spiraled upward like smoke rising from an ancient battlefield. "I don't belong to you anymore," she declared with absolute finality. "I never really did." The colonel's face twisted into something ancient and terrible. Not pure rage, but genuine loss. The bone-deep loss of absolute control. "You'll regret this decision for the rest of your life," he whispered like a curse. "I already did regret it," she said calmly, "but now I'm completely finished with regret." She left without saying another word, but before she walked out forever, she paused in the parlor and looked up at the old family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Silas in his military uniform, her mother looking delicate as porcelain, and Isabel seated between them with perfect posture like a doll. She stared at that image for a long moment, then picked up the heavy fireplace poker and shattered the glass covering completely. It cracked like thunder splitting the sky. No one in the house moved or spoke. They just watched in stunned silence. As Isabel turned to leave forever, one of the servants, An older woman with a deep scar across her cheek and tears streaming down her face pressed something small into her hand, a cloth pouch filled with healing herbs. "For the pain, when it comes," the woman said softly. "Mine or his?" Isabel asked. The woman smiled through her tears and squeezed Isabel's hand like a blessing. Isabel clutched that pouch like a sacred gift and walked into exile with fire behind her and unshakable purpose in every step. Back at their hidden refuge, she found Jonathan waiting anxiously. He stood up immediately when he saw her, concern written across his features. "You went back to face him. It's finished now." He walked over and placed both hands gently on her belly. "What happens next?" She looked at him, exhausted but radiant with newfound freedom. "Now we give our child a name," she said, "one that isn't poisoned by the past." They chose Malachi, which means messenger in ancient languages, because this child, they firmly believed, wasn't being born to hide from the world, but to announce something the world refused to hear: that love is not a crime, that family bloodlines are not chains of loyalty, that legacy is always a choice. But fire, once properly lit, has a tendency to spread in unexpected directions. Chapter 10. The Child Who Changed History. The night Malachi was born, the wind held its breath. The entire Mississippi Delta seemed to pause, as if nature itself had stopped to witness what no amount of hatred, tradition, or violence could prevent: the arrival of truth, wrapped in human flesh. They had found shelter in a small cabin outside Vicksburg, far enough from the Calhoun plantation to breathe freely, close enough that shadows from the past could still follow them. The floor was packed dirt, the roof patched with tar paper and desperate prayers, but it was home. It was theirs. Inside that humble space, a circle of women moved like a sacred ceremony. Some were former midwives with steady hands. Others were freed women who had learned the ancient skills from mothers who delivered babies beside cotton stalks and under the threat of gunfire. They understood the significance of this moment. They knew exactly who this child represented. Isabel gripped Jonathan's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. He kept his jaw clenched, every muscle tense with protective energy. "She's strong," the eldest midwife whispered with admiration, "just like her mother was." "No," Jonathan said, his eyes never leaving Isabel's face. "She's stronger than anyone who came before." The room was thick with summer heat, burning incense, and the weight of historical memory. Outside, the world waited to condemn this child who was already considered cursed by those who couldn't imagine black and white mixing without violence. But inside, a different kind of judgment was taking place, a holy reckoning. When the baby finally slipped into the world, covered in blood, truth, and the breath of life, everything changed in that instant. He didn't cry immediately. The room went completely still. Then the eldest midwife leaned close to the newborn and whispered something in his ear, words in a language that was no longer spoken aloud, only felt in the soul. And suddenly he cried, long and strong like thunder breaking centuries of enforced silence. Jonathan collapsed to his knees. Isabel wept like a river overflowing its... And the women in the room smiled with deep satisfaction. "He knows exactly where he came from," one of them whispered, "and he knows what he's here to accomplish." They named him Malachi, messenger, not of peace but of uncomfortable truth, because truth never arrives quietly. It always comes screaming. The news reached the Calhoun plantation within a week. A distant cousin who worked for the local newspaper brought the shocking headline, hands trembling as he delivered it. "Isabel Calhoun bears son by former slave, defies Southern legacy." Beneath the bold letters was a blurry photograph. Jonathan holding the baby protectively, Isabel standing beside him with fierce pride, the child wrapped in simple cloth like a challenge to everything the Old South represented. Colonel Silas Calhoun dropped the newspaper and staggered backward. For the first time in his entire life, he looked truly old, defeated by something stronger than armies or laws or tradition. "Get me the sheriff," he whispered through gritted teeth. The cousin hesitated nervously. "On what charges, sir?" The colonel's voice came out like a dying snake. "Existing." In Vicksburg, word spread faster than wildfire. Some people wanted to drive them out with stones and threats. Others wanted to protect them at any cost. Black families brought food, blankets, and candles. White abolitionists sent letters from up north. "We will pay for your protection and support." But Isabel refused every offer to relocate somewhere safer. "He was born here in Mississippi," she said with absolute determination. "Let him grow up here too." Jonathan agreed completely. but stayed constantly alert. At night, he kept a loaded pistol beside their bed, not for revenge or violence, but for survival. Because a child like Malachi didn't just challenge old names and traditions, he threatened the fundamental myths that white supremacy was built on. One afternoon, Jonathan took baby Malachi to the local market, holding him close against his chest in a cloth sling. People stare, in shock and confusion. A black man carrying what appeared to be a white baby. No, a black man carrying his own child, his own flesh and blood. Some people looked away in discomfort, others spit on the ground in disgust. But some, mostly elderly folks who had seen enough bloodshed in their lifetimes to recognize when something new refused to apologize for existing, nodded with quiet respect. Malachi's eyes, even as a tiny newborn, seemed to scan the crowd, like he was memorizing every face, like he was already remembering everything they desperately wanted to forget. But safety is always temporary when you're living in the shadow of hatred. One night, their cabin door shook violently under heavy fists. A threatening voice called out from the darkness. "Calhoun sent us. Hand over the girl and the bastard child." Jonathan stood immediately, gun drawn, positioning his body between the door and his family. But before he could fire a single shot, shadows emerged from the surrounding woods. Neighbors, freedmen and women, elderly folks carrying rifles and torches. A former preacher named Ezekiel stepped forward as their spokesman. "Not tonight," he announced with biblical authority. "Not this child." The attackers retreated into the darkness, but the community kept watch for days afterward. Because Malachi had become something much bigger than just a baby. He had become a living symbol, proof that the old ways were crumbling. And some people would rather burn the whole world down than admit they were wrong. Isabel continued writing letters to newspapers, to political allies, to universities. She told her story in her own words, refusing interviews from northern journalists who wanted to paint her as a victim or fallen woman. "I am not a tragedy," she wrote in bold letters. "I am a mother. I am a witness. And I am completely free." Her words were reprinted in political pamphlets, shared in private parlors, quoted from progressive pulpits. And one morning, a package arrived at their door. Inside was a leather-bound Bible from her late mother's cousin in Boston, and tucked inside that was a legal deed. 1 full acre of land to the west with a simple message written in careful handwriting. If he is destined to walk in freedom, let him do so on land that was never watered with chains. Chapter 11. The Fall of a Dynasty. By 1874, the Calhoun name had lost its magic. What once opened every door in the Mississippi Delta now barely whispered in empty hallways. Colonel Silas Calhoun, who used to command respect just by entering a room, now sat alone in his decaying mansion, watching his empire crumble one brick at a time. The lawsuit came quietly, but cut like a blade. Jonathan Reed, working with the Freedmen's Bureau, filed official papers in the Vicksburg courthouse, not seeking revenge, but demanding something far more dangerous: accountability. "I worked for 19 years without wages," Jonathan told the court with calm dignity. "No contract, no compensation, only chains around my wrists. I would simply like to be paid for my time and labor." The courtroom erupted in nervous laughter at first, but then came the evidence. Detailed records that Isabel had carefully preserved. Testimonies from other former workers. Financial ledgers showing massive profits built on stolen labor. Letters that implicated Colonel Calhoun in illegal deals with Confederate militias, even after the war had ended. What started as a personal scandal transformed into a legal case, and what began as a legal case became a public reckoning with history itself. The trial stretched on for months. Southern newspapers refused to print updates about the proceedings. Northern journalists swarmed the courthouse like hungry wolves. Isabel testified wearing complete black, her voice steady and unshakable. "I do not speak against my father out of hatred," she declared from the witness stand. "I speak because I refuse to raise my son in a world built on lies that everyone agrees to keep quiet." When Jonathan took his turn to testify, his voice was measured and controlled. "I don't want his land or his blood money," he said clearly. "I just want the South to say out loud what it actually did to human beings." The final judgment shocked everyone involved, not because of the financial amount awarded, which was only a small fraction of what was actually owed, but because of the language the judge used in his official ruling. The judge, a former Union officer, wrote these words that would be remembered for generations. "This court recognizes not just labor that was stolen, but entire lives that were stolen, and it acknowledges for the historical record that whiteness is not inheritance. Character is the only true inheritance." The ruling was printed in newspapers, framed in the courthouse, taught in schools for black children, and throughout the Delta, the old silence began to crack and crumble. Colonel Calhoun never left his house again after that day. Servants stopped coming to work. Family members stopped visiting. Even the local preacher moved his services to another county to avoid association with the name. Silas spent his final days sitting in his high-backed chair on the veranda, wrapped in a wool blanket like a sick old man, drinking bourbon like medicine for a wound that would never heal. He refused to speak Jonathan's name out loud, refused to acknowledge Isabel's letters, 3 of them offering reconciliation and forgiveness, refused to visit the cemetery where his wife lay beneath a headstone now cracked from years of neglect. Pride was all he had left in the world, and even that had begun to rot and stink. One morning, Ezekiel, the former preacher who had become a community activist, walked up the steps of the Calhoun mansion without asking permission. His boots echoed against the decaying wood like drum beats. The colonel sat motionless, staring at nothing. Ezekiel didn't bother to sit down. He looked the broken man directly in the eye and spoke with biblical authority. "You spent your entire life building a kingdom out of human chains. Now you're living alone in the wreckage. How does it feel, Silas, to be completely powerless, ruled by the very people you tried to own like livestock?" The colonel didn't answer, didn't even blink, just continued staring out at the empty fields as if the cotton might magically return if he waited long enough. Ezekiel shook his head with disgust. "Rot in your silence then," he said, and walked away forever. But the Mississippi Delta doesn't bury shame quietly. It has a way of spitting secrets back up to the surface. That fall, a group of students from a freedmen's school arrived with their teacher from up north. They requested permission to tour the plantation for historical research purposes. Permission was never officially granted. They came anyway. They photographed the deteriorating mansion, sketched the whipping post that still stood behind the old barn like a monument to cruelty, interviewed former workers in nearby towns who were finally willing to tell their stories. They compiled everything into a pamphlet titled "The House That Pain Built." On the cover was a detailed drawing of the Calhoun mansion, windows shattered, ivy creeping up the walls like nature reclaiming what humans had corrupted. Underneath the image, a simple but powerful message. This is not just a ruin. This is a warning. Jonathan received a copy in the mail. He sat with Isabel and 12-year-old Malachi under the oak tree behind their modest but happy home, filled with books, laughter, and honest light. The boy read the entire pamphlet out loud, his voice steady and his eyes sharp with intelligence. When he finished reading, he looked at both his parents with curiosity. "Does that happens to places like that now?" Jonathan smiled with deep satisfaction. "You get to write what happens next." And Malachi did exactly that. His essays were published in New York journals by age 16. By 20, he was speaking in Boston lecture halls about legacy, race, and the power of memory. But he never changed his name or tried to hide his story. He called himself Malachi Reed, the messenger who came to judge the past and build the future. Colonel Silas Calhoun died alone during a particularly brutal winter, found slumped in his chair with an empty bottle in his hand, and the fireplace long since gone cold. No funeral, no preacher, no mourners. Just a handwritten note left in his study, unsigned but unmistakably in his handwriting. "I built a monument to myself, and all I have left is silence." Chapter 12. The New Foundation. Malachi Reed stood at the edge of the old Calhoun property one final time. The grass had grown wild and tall. The once grand veranda had collapsed under the weight of time and neglect. Thick vines wrapped around the brick walls like nature slowly digesting what humans had built on stolen labor. The school that had started in the ruins of the old mansion had outgrown its original location years ago. A new, larger campus now stood near Vicksburg, brighter, more modern, filled with children whose grandparents had once picked cotton for pennies and promises that were never kept. But Malachi had returned to this place today for one specific purpose, not to remember the land, but to finally release the weight of what had happened here. Isabel had passed away 2 years earlier, at the remarkable age of 87. She died peacefully in her sleep, holding a letter from Jonathan, one he had written during his final days years before. She had read it every single night like a prayer or sacred poem. Malachi buried her beside Jonathan beneath the same oak tree where she had once whispered his name for the very first time. No elaborate marble monuments, no carved angels, just a simple stone with the inscription she had requested. Isabel, not belonging to anyone, just Isabel. Malachi rarely cried openly, but when he lowered that headstone into the earth, he wept like a child again. Not from grief or sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally letting go. Because she had given him everything a mother could give. Not just life and love, but the courage to carry a story that the Old South had tried desperately to erase from history. Now, standing among the ruins of his grandfather's empire, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the last object still connected to the Calhoun legacy, the family seal. Heavy gold, tarnished by decades of handling, passed down through generations like a sacred relic, once worn on Silas Calhoun's ring finger like a brand of ownership. Isabel had hidden it from her father before fleeing the plantation. She had kept it safe and given it to Malachi when she knew her time was ending. "Do with it whatever needs to be done," she had told him, with her final instructions. Today, he would complete that task. He walked slowly to the old well at the back of the property, the same well where his parents had first exchanged poetry and secret messages, where rebellion had bloomed beneath the shade of the sycamore tree. Malachi looked down into the darkness below, deep, silent, ancient, like the secrets it had swallowed over the years. Then he whispered to the ghosts of everyone who had suffered on this land. "This is for every name you buried that wasn't considered important enough to remember." And he dropped the ring into the depths. It struck stone once with a sharp metallic clink, then disappeared forever like the myth and power it had represented. He stood in complete silence for several minutes, then turned to walk away from that place for the final time. At the front gate, a young girl was waiting for him, no older than 10 years old, with skin like rich coffee and eyes that sparkled like stars at midnight. She wore the uniform of his school, her hair braided with obvious care and attention. "Mr. Reed?" she asked politely. He smiled warmly. "Yes, child. My mama told me you knew the people who used to live in that old house." He nodded thoughtfully. "I did know them." "What were they like?" she asked with innocent curiosity. He looked back at the ruins one final time, then took her small hand in his. They were a lesson that everyone needed to learn. Together they walked toward the main road, and behind them, wind moved through the tall grass like the breath of ancestors. Not mourning, not angry, just watching quietly and whispering approval. Some names die in fires. Some names rot away in silence and shame. But some names, the ones that truly matter, remain forever. And Malachi Reed's name endured, not because of bloodlines or inherited power, but because he carried historical memory without shame and taught an entire country that forgetting the past is easy, but remembering it honestly is sacred work. Epilogue: The legacy that lives forever. The story of Isabel Calhoun and Jonathan Reed spread far beyond the Mississippi Delta. Their love became legend. Their child became proof that the future refuses to be chained by the failures of the past. And their courage became a light that still shines today for anyone brave enough to choose love over fear, truth over comfort, and justice over tradition. If you've stayed with this incredible story until the very end, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with someone who needs to know that the past wasn't erased. It was just hidden, waiting for the right voices to bring it back into the light where it belongs. And the house may have fallen, but the truth it revealed will stand forever.